In the last module, we showed you some of the baseline elements or components that make up a unified service desk environment. We talked a little bit about hosted controls, we talked a little bit about events. Now what I want to do is I want to delve into a little bit more detail into each and every one of those. And the first one is hosted controls. And hosted controls are really critical to a USD deployment in the fact that they're the baseline. They're where everything is going to start. Most everything in some capacity is going to come in as part of a hosted control. So in this module, we want to first and foremost talk about, what are they and how are they used and how do they build into the application. We want to talk about the different types of hosted controls that make up a unified service desk deployment. We want to talk a little bit about the ones that are required. So there's certain hosted control types that just have to be in every type of deployment that you're going to work with. And you have to have those in order for it to work. So we want to talk about what those two specific ones are. Then we'll start getting into more of the common-based hosted controls, the ones that you're going to see most often inside a unified service desk deployment. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the other ones that you could use for specific type of functionality that you would be using when you're moving. So the hosted control concept is really central to a unified service desk implementation. It's really the main building agent or building block for all of the different items that you're going to build throughout the concept of a unified service desk. Now, really what they are at its core is they're really just kind of a .NET component. They could be a CRM page or an external web application, but there's something that is hosted inside that agent application. So when you open up that application, they're hosted inside that specific area. And so as you saw in some of the demos that we've done, when we click on like an account record or a contact record, that's opening up a hosted control. When we look at that knowledge management solution to search for a knowledge management option, that's opening up through a hosted control. When you look at an agent script, that's opening up through a hosted control. And so you build these hosted controls specifically with the thought that you want to provide some piece of functionality. So really think of the hosted controls as a service that is going to be displayed inside the application, or almost like a black box functionality. They're really a container. So inside this container, I'm going to display specific components or specific elements within that scenario. And so as we build these different hosted controls, we really don't want them to have any dependencies on other items. We don't want this hosted control to be contingent on something else happening within the application. We want to be able to control that information with action calls and actions inside the application. So really think of, as we've said, in a few different scenarios, think of these hosted controls as kind of the baseline building blocks for what you want to do inside USD, and then the other information will then come on top of that and then build that functionality moving. So first and foremost, there's two hosted control types that every USD deployment has to have. And they're critical from a couple of different perspectives. The big thing to remember is you can only have one of each of these. So there's two hosted control types called one called Connection Manager and one called Global Manager. And each one of these have to exist in a USD deployment. And the reason behind that is because these are going to handle some of your connection situations, and these are going to control how different elements interface with the application itself. The other remaining hosted controls that we're going to talk about, as we go through the remainder of this module, you can mix and match those all you want. If you want to, have a bunch of different CRM pages, if you want to have some hosted web pages or create your own, that's fine. But you have to make sure that at the very least, each one of these two are implemented and brought into your organization only once. And the first one is the Connection Manager. And this one, is pretty straightforward when you think about, what it is. But basically, this provides the central connection point to your Dynamics 365 implementation. And this is what's going to maintain that connection as well. So once it connects, it's going to connect to that environment, and it's going to maintain that connection. This is going to have a lot of your different query services that are going to be used for those hosted controls. So this is what's going to go in and query a lot of the different information inside the item itself. This is also what's going to provide logging of queries. So as it's going in and querying and pulling information from the application, it's going to log log that information, and it's also going to provide timing. So if you have a situation where something doesn't necessarily load the way that it should load, this is where you can actually go in and kind of debug, and you can determine, why something didn't work the way that it did. So this is the central connection scenario for your environment that is connecting to Dynamics 365. And again, you can only have one of these connection managers defined within your environment, because this is what is establishing your connection to your CRM or to your Dynamics 365 environment. The other one that you have is your global manager. And so this is really what's going to give you the capabilities to do a lot of your configuration. So this is really the heart of Unified Service Desk, and this is the main services that are used to configure the application itself. This loads all of the configuration stuff at startup. This will read all the information from cache, from the cache when the application is turned on, and to determine what it should load. So this is what recognizes the user. This is what recognizes what environment it should connect to. This is if you have localization. So if you have different languages for different environments that you're working with, this is what's going to recognize the localization option and then load the specific localized language tags for the users that you're working with. This is what's also going to control a lot of your navigation rules. So this is the core functionality for the application itself. And so this is what goes in and launches your action calls. This gives you the capabilities to execute action calls kind of at a global level. This what gives you the capabilities to execute events at a global level or on behalf of specific hosted control. So for example, if I wanted to open up like the debugger, I wouldn't want the debugger to be loaded into a specific session inside Unified Service Desk. I'd want the debugger to be loaded globally, so I can work with different sessions based upon where I'm at. And that's what the Global Manager allows us to do. This has a lot of different actions and items that are out there for building USD configurations. This is what's going to give you the ability to execute your actions and fire events in the system, evaluate your navigation rules. This is really the first and foremost hosted control inside the application that you're going to use. And we'll show you when we start building some of these different items how the Global Manager kind of fits into the heart and soul of what's going to happen in there. The next few hosted controls we want to talk about are pretty common. They're not necessarily required, but you're pretty much going to see them in every USD implementation that you're going to work with. The first one is what's called a CRM page. And so the CRM page is what allows you to target or to be the target of routing rules for information that's going to pop up inside CRM or inside Dynamics 365. This also has a bunch of different scripts and items that recognize replacement parameters when that information are called and then pull that information in. So this is really the main type of hosted control that has specific functionality built and worked around specifically targeting Dynamics 365 pages that are loaded in. Now you'll see that it says CRM page. It's still referenced as a CRM page inside the application, but it does work to load in Dynamics 365 functionality within the application. So there's specialized actions and things that are targeted specifically at Dynamics 365 functionality. Then you have a hosted control for session tabs. So this is what's really going to give you your session capability. So when you click on a specific record inside the application, this is what's going to allow you to open up the session in a new kind of session tab. As you can see with the option that we see here, this is what also gives us the functionality to be able to control whether or not, how those tabs are named. Are they named a specific record type or item within the application? What specific scenarios are we seeing within here? And then we have our toolbars hosted controls, which are our containers for storing toolbars that we're going to interact with as part of the application itself. Now the nice thing with these toolbars is they have different buttons, and these buttons, as we click on them, will initiate different action calls inside the system. Now these are the kind of some of the more common ones. Other ones that you might see inside there are the debugger, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about the debugger here in its own individual model, but this is really useful for troubleshooting scenarios. scenarios. Something that didn't necessarily go right in the application, I want to see what that situation is. I'm going to go ahead and open up the debugger. This also gives me the capabilities to see the context in regards to which data is opened up inside the application. Agent scripting, that's another real common hosted control, and we've talked a little bit about that. That's obviously going to provide your step-by-step guidance as you're working through. And then session lines, those are another one. What's nice about session lines is they look at the item or the record that you're open, and then they display specific pieces of information. So you'll oftentimes hear this referred to as like a 360-degree view. This is what gives you some of that baseline functionality. So when I'm on an account and I open up a contact for that account, it'll still keep the account information displayed. And so it really just uses what is called XAML to go ahead and define how this information is displayed. And this is all configurable based upon how people are interacting with the application. And we'll talk a little bit more about session lines kind of in the last module when we talk about where you can kind of go from here. But these are some of the more common ones. So what I'd like to do now is I want to take you into the application or into Dynamics 365, and we'll just kind of create a couple of different hosted controls and show you the baseline functionality and what's involved with those. So if I go back into settings and I go into Unified Service Desk, I can click on hosted controls. And so first and foremost, you'll see those two that we talked about, the connection manager that is kind of your first and foremost, and your global manager. I'm going to open up the connection manager. This is actually not something that typically gets seen within the application, but this just defines what it is, that it's the connection manager and that it's using the connection manager options. There isn't any real additional information configured around this because this is what is supporting the connection functionality that we're seeing in the application. The other one that you're going to see in here is that one that we talked about for hosted controls when we start talking about your global manager. This is the one that's going to have a lot of your hidden functionality. So you can see that it has our language services that are associated with it. Also, if I come up into this option from here, this will also have some different actions and items that are attached to it that control functionality within the application. Now, we haven't talked about actions yet, but this is what we can see where we are creating a new CRM page, opening pages, firing pop-up windows, sizing items. These are things that would, in global context, apply to most elements that we want to work with. And so what this global manager does is it supports all of those different individual elements so we can execute functionality inside the application on kind of a global scale as we're moving forward. And we'll show you this when we start moving into some of the future modules in regards to how that initiates together. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go back into hosted controls one last time. And I want to open up like this account CRM page hosted control because I just want to kind of show you something here in regards to this. So you'll see when we've defined this account hosted control, obviously they've given it a name of account. They've specified it as a CRM page. They've specified that it is displaying within the main panel. Under no area here have we seen anywhere where it really specifies the account entity inside Dynamics 365. And I think that's the big thing to remember when we start talking about the application itself. This is a container that we've created where our intent is to load account information into it, which is why we've called it the account hosted control. Realistically, when I use an action call, I can load anything into this panel that I want. But from an application perspective, I'm calling it account to kind of keep things brought off into my situation. So you can see, other than the display name, which is pulling some information from the account entity, it's really not referencing the account entity inside Dynamics 365. And that is very much by initial intent when you start talking about it. This is strictly a container that we're going to create to store information. The actual information will not get stored in this container until we use a combination of action calls with UAI actions to facilitate the population of that information. So that's why I wanted to open this up so you could see that a little bit in the grand scheme of things, that it's not really storing specific functionality. And I want to show you that by creating kind of a new one. So we're going to go in and we're going to create a new hosted control. And maybe our intent with this hosted control is, we want to open up an opportunity, or we want to open up some other type of functionality that we're using within the application. Maybe I want to open up a new custom entity that I'm going to create called bank account. I'm going to create a hosted control that's going to allow me to do that. So I'm going to create a hosted control called bank account. I'm going to specify how I want this to be sorted. In this case, I don't need to worry about the sort order. Now, when I go into this Unified Service Desk hosted control type, these are all the different types of hosted controls that I have inside the application. So you can see that I could make this a CRM page. I could make this a dialog page, which is very similar to a CRM page, except for it has specific functionality to recognize dialogue-based requirements that happen in the application. I could make this a interactive service hub page. I could make this a panel layout. These are different types of options. Now, we're not going to get into every single one of these. We'll talk a little bit more about some of them towards the end, but these are options that I can choose. The next thing that I have to define is how I want this hosted. Is this going to be an internal process, or is this going to be something that's going to be hosted through IE? Well, this is a web page, so we're going to host this through Internet Explorer. Is this going to be something that's going to be globally available, or is this going to be more session specific? And so that's where the application is global. Things like the debugger and things that don't necessarily need to be tied to a specific session are typically things that you're going to make global. Things like CRM pages that are going to display entities inside the application are typically going to be session specific. And so in here, you're going to typically leave those open the way that they are from this standpoint. Then you're going to see things like display group. So up until this point, we've seen when we've opened things up, they've displayed kind of in that centralized screen within the Unified Service Desk panel. One of the things we'll talk about towards the end of this course is this concept of panel layouts and being able to control where things display inside the application. And so what this option here says is, where do you want things to display? If you don't choose anything here, or if you don't select anything here, it'll always default to the main panel, because it always wants to push things into the main panel. In this case, we'll just go ahead and leave it the way it is. And then this is where we can also decide how things are kind of being dynamically populated, and if the user can close this hosted control within the application. And yes, they can to both of these options. So now we would go ahead and hit save and close. Now that's really all there is to it. Now if you want to custom develop a hosted control, you can go in and you can custom develop your own hosted control, and there's some options in there as well. We'll talk about that from a developer perspective, but depending upon the type of hosted control that it is, that's really all that you have to do, is define the name, define where you want it to be displayed, define the type of hosted control that it is, where it's going to be hosted, if it's going to be global or not, and then save it. Because the interaction with that is all going to take place inside the application from an action and an action call perspective when you're moving forward. As you saw when we went in and did the demo, there's a lot of other hosted control types that you can use based upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish inside the application. One of the key ones that you'll see quite a bit is the standard web application. And so this is obviously something that you're going to use anytime you want to host something that's non-Dynamics 365 or a non-CRM web page. So this might be a portal, or this might be some other web application that's being used within the context of your line of business situation. So non-CRM specific type functionality. Now we also talked a little bit about the CRM dialog when we were working with the information from there. That's the one that it's very similar from what it has inside the application to a CRM page, except for most of the functionality that you have on there is targeted towards dialogue forms. So this is if you have specific dialogues that you want to host inside the application, you can work with it from there. There's also the Interactive Service Hub one. So if you have an Interactive Service Hub page that you want to display inside there, you have the capabilities to work with that as well. The next one below the CRM dialog is the desktop manager. This is for phone integration. And so from a phone integration standpoint, the desktop manager handles a lot of the interfacing with a third-party phone system. So if you want to transfer calls, you would be able to use the desktop manager to be able to write almost like a custom adapter that would be able to facilitate that information when you're going through. So that's going to be more from a phone application perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about CTI integration when we're moving forward. You also get into things like panel layouts. So one of the things we talked about, briefly in the last module was the fact that you can customize the layout. So one of the things that hosted controls allow you to do is to create what's called a panel layout that gives you the capabilities to go in and control how things are laid out inside the application itself. So where these panels are located. So we saw that thing on the main panel. We could create different panel layouts that control how things are displayed inside that main panel and lay things out accordingly. And then there's like user notes. There's your that gives you the capabilities to display different notes inside the application tied to users. You can create to-do lists, which are more like check-off type situations that you can work with from there. And then you get into like your CCA hosted applications and your USD hosted controls. If you wanted to create your own hosted control from scratch, custom develop it, that has its own events, its own actions, and all of that information specifically associated with it, this is where you could go in and create and custom develop and register your own custom hosted control in the application. Or if you have a custom hosted application, you can use CCA hosted applications to custom develop that information. But again, those would require a developer to come in there. Now again, these aren't the only hosted controls that are available, but they're some of the more standardized ones that you would see outside of just the individual ones. So at least wanted to mention those as an option when you're going in and looking at it. So as you can see, it's nice to have an idea for the specific use cases that you're going to use to determine what specific hosted controls you can work with. If you're looking for kind of a nice starting point to see where I might need things and what might constitute working together, the sample data works well because there's a lot of predetermined hosted controls already in there, like the Bing Maps control and the CRM page controls. So you can start to get kind of a look and an idea and a feel for what's out there. But the key thing to remember about this module is, hosted controls are really your cornerstone for what you want to do within the application. They're really the baseline or primary building blocks for how you're going to work with it. Everything to some degree is going to be associated with a hosted control. When an application or a CRM page is loaded inside the application, it's loaded inside a hosted control. When an external web page is loaded inside the application, it's loaded inside a hosted control. Realistically, even when you start looking at toolbars and some of those options, those are typically still constituted within the context of a hosted control, even the session tabs. So they really are the cornerstone for what you'd be looking at. When you're deciding how you're going to build this application, remember that you have two specific hosted controls that have to exist in every environment. And they're going to constitute the global manager and the connection manager. The connection manager really stores the connection-based information into that Dynamics 365 environment that you want to connect to, whereas the global manager has all the other stuff. That's the stuff that's going to control how events are fired, that's going to control how navigation rules are fired. That's really the global context in regards to how the application is going to work. The remainder part of the hosted controls are really used for specific functionality. So it's up to you to determine what specific hosted controls are going to work best for you based upon the type of environmental implementation that you're doing. And then you just go in and kind of pick and choose the ones that you want to use accordingly.